then we can continue our discussions from here. So I want to give you a recap of what Synod 2022 was like. My name is Pastor Chad Worthington, the pastor here at Worthington Christian Reformed Church, and I was a delegate for Classis Minn Kota. And so coming into Synod 2022, my expectations, quite frankly, were low. And we came in with 3 criteria from our classes, from our congregation here, that we wanted to see accomplished at this Synod. We wanted to see the heresy that we had seen in so many different aspects. We wanted to see discipline come to that. We also wanted orthodoxy to be not only defended, but promoted. Those are 2 different things, and we wanted to see both of those things happen. And quite frankly, I said there's no way that Synod is going to be able to accomplish these 3 things in this day and age. And so my expectations were that we were not going to meet those criteria, and so because of that, Classis Minn Kota for a while now has been actively preparing for a contingency plan. Almost expecting that Synod would not be successful and that we would have to do something different, that we would likely have to leave this denomination. And I've never been so grateful in my life to have been completely wrong. My expectations were low, but by God's grace, I think that we've met these criteria. I think that we have a future with the Christian Reformed Church, and I'm grateful to be able to say that. So let's pull this apart a little bit more and see if we can understand it. What did we accomplish at this Synod? The accomplishments were massive. It was quite an experience. I've been to Synod before. The Synod that I went to about a decade ago, completely different experience than what I had this time. I don't want to get into too many of those details. I had a great set of delegates from Classis Minn Kota that held me up. I held them up at times. Very, very emotionally exhausting, really exhausting on every aspect. This Synod was emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting, mentally exhausting, even spiritually exhausting. I'll tell you about that maybe if we get time to talk one-on-one, but I just want to go over what some of these accomplishments were that were the result of all of that exhaustion that we experienced. We passed the Human Sexuality Report. Now, it's important to be reminded here that the HSR, as it's often referred to, is a comprehensive report on all aspects of society. And so one of the things that we need to come to grips with here is that condemning what we often refer to as LGBT activity, while ignoring pornography, adultery, and all sorts of other sexual sins. In other words, to say that these sins are worse than these sins, we have to understand that that's wrong, that all sexual sins are wrong. All sexual sins are an affront to our holy God, and we can't just pigeonhole one set of activity and say, well, that's really, really wrong, that needs discipline, but we're going to kind of ignore this other activity. We can't do that. Obviously, though, most of the controversy was in regards to LGBT, and I'll let you fill in however many other letters you think you need to add to that, to their practice, or to that practice. That's where the controversy was. And really the most important part of this Human Sexuality Report is what was commonly known as Recommendation D. And we passed that along with this report, and what that says is that our confessions have always maintained, this is not something new, we're just recognizing something that was already there, that all sexual activity outside of a covenantal marriage between a man and a woman is sinful. And the word that we spent so much time talking about was that word unchaste, or its opposite, chastity, in question and answer 108 of the Heidelberg Catechism. And this recommendation passed overwhelmingly. That has some big ramifications. This is a big deal because we're a confessional church. That means as we have these 3 documents, we call them the 3 forms of unity, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort. And as officers of the church, we say that these doctrines fully agree with the Word of God. It means if you disagree with these confessions, you're disagreeing with the Word of God. That's a big deal. And so as officers, elders, and deacons and ministers, we promise to conform our preaching and teaching within the boundaries of these confessions. That means that officers cannot publicly promote and defend homosexual lifestyles and practices. And really, this represents a seismic shift in the Christian Reformed Church. That we're going to take our stand here, that we're not going to allow this. I didn't see this coming. I didn't think we'd be successful. Quite frankly, neither did our opponents on this. They didn't see it coming either, and so it was quite shocking for them to experience it. What else did we accomplish? We disciplined heresy. Say, hey, wait a second. I didn't see the word discipline or the word heresy being used in any of these matters that we were talking about. Well, let's dig into this a little bit. We need to understand that heresy is a big word. It's to deny one of the critical aspects of our three ecumenical creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. These creeds that we've had for well over, in some cases, 1,800 years that we've agreed as Christians. In other words, deny something like the deity of Jesus Christ. That's heresy. To say that only believers will be baptized as our Baptist neighbors do, that's not heresy. It's wrong, according to us as Reformed Christians, but it's not heresy. So we may make this distinction here. We've got to be careful about using the word heresy. We don't want to use it loosely. And actually, there was an idiot that worked in the thing that came up with 9-point criteria of what heresy is. Now, the argument being made that some topics that we discussed at Synod this year met all 9 of the requirements that laid out in order to be considered heresy. But I want to encourage you right now at this point, don't get hung up on these semantics. Because everything that we accomplished at Synod treats these topics that we're talking about, human sexuality, the denial of self-substitutionary atonement, treated them on the level as if they were heresy. We treated them from a confessional standpoint rather than a heresy standpoint, and that's a slight nuance, but it's just as effective. So don't get too hung up on these semantics. The way that we would probably say it is not that we disciplined heresy, it's that we initiated correction. And it's just a semantic change in words there. Really the meaning is the same thing. Neeland Avenue Christian Reformed Church, Grand Rapids, Michigan, was really the instigator of a lot of this stuff. They went out ahead of the congregation would say that they broke covenant with us and appointing a same-sex or a deacon who was in a same-sex relationship, marriage, which is now we can fully say wrong, sinful, in the eyes of our confessions and in the eyes of Scripture. And so we initiated corrections upon them. That deacon's term is now dissolved. That lady is no longer a deacon. That was by action of Synod. Neeland Avenue was told to comply with the denominational position on same-sex marriage. There was no ambiguity about that. And just to make sure that they comply, an oversight committee will be assigned to help us get that done. Just checking my notes here to make sure that I'm conveying everything that I wanted to convey to you. Not only was Neeland Avenue was correction initiated, but we also then initiated correction against Classis Grand Rapids East, largely for their failure to discipline Neeland Avenue, which was one of their churches. And so what's going to happen to Classis Grand Rapids East? They're going to get an oversight committee as well. And not just that oversight committee, but there will be representatives, if needed, from 3 outside classes or groups of churches to help make sure that they toe the line, that they come alongside and into alignment with what our denomination is now held to be confessionally true. These committees will give a report to Synod 2023. Either Neeland Avenue and Classis Grand Rapids East will have come into alignment, and will rejoice if they do, or they won't. Then we'll have the mechanisms in place. We'll have the mechanisms in place to initiate further discipline at that point in time. Now, we had something come up at the end of this meeting, and I want to read what I had written for another submission here, and so that you understand what happened and why this is important. The council president of Neeland Avenue addressed the body, the synod, after all of our decisions had been handed down. And he came up, he spoke from the podium with the permission of the chair, and you could hear a pin drop in the room as he spoke. He said that Neeland had no interest in leaving the Christian Reformed Church, and that they will take our instructions seriously. And it will be very hard for them to do that. I get that. This ought to be hard for them to do. But if at this point he would have just even sort of repented, even if he had just apologized for the hurt that their actions in breaking covenant had caused with the rest of the denomination, I think at that point the room, all of the delegates would have erupted in praise and thanksgiving. Remember, this is always our goal in church discipline, is restoration. If he would have taken a step in that direction, oh, that would have been fantastic. But he didn't. After being instructed to do so, he said that his council will not initiate discipline over its members which are living in sin, because they don't have the stomach for it. He rejected the very thing that we overwhelmingly decided after 3 years, not just a week, 3 years of intense debate within our denomination. Well, at this point in his speech to us, a colleague of ours from Classis Ileana stood up. He confronted the stubbornness of this council president, this elder, and boldly told him to stop. At this point, the chairman, Jose Reyes, both he and Derek Buchema did a fantastic job in running these deliberations. Jose was visibly shaken at what had just unfolded. Many of us were. Tears were in our eyes at this point because redemption was so close, but yet just taken away. He called for the body to pray again together. We prayed often throughout this process, and our executive director led that prayer. And it was during that prayer that I was convicted that I needed to stand up and move that special discipline be initiated against this particular elder. My motion was ruled out of order by the chairman, and a vote to challenge that ruling was not sustained. Now, understand, I agree that the motion that I made was technically out of order, but yet I needed to stand up and say those words. I deeply regret that this incident occurred, but I do not regret taking the action that I did. I would do it again. And I have confidence, though, moving forward, that this sort of continued rebellious and schismatic behavior will not be tolerated by subsequent synods. So we disciplined heresy or initiated corrections, however we want to say that. What else did we do at this synod? I thought I had a slide in here about human sexuality. Let's see what we got here. I'm not human sexuality, penal substitutionary atonement. And I don't see that. But we also declared that any office bearer who explicitly denies penal substitutionary atonement, this was a big deal, right? This is penal substitutionary atonement. You're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that Jesus Christ bared our cost. He substituted himself as he died on the cross. He paid our penalty so that he could supply us with his perfect righteousness. That's really the core of our Reformed faith, isn't it? It's so present in our Reformed confessions. Now, we do understand that there are other aspects of the atonement. Jesus Christ declared victory over all things as he atoned for us. He gave us an example of what it means to love one another. He gave us an example, what we call the moral example in the atonement. All of those things are true and valid, but they all depend upon penal substitutionary atonement. That's the primary thing that was accomplished. So here's what we did. We said that any office bearer who explicitly denies penal substitutionary atonement is worthy of special discipline in accordance with Church Article 83. So certainly it's concerning that we had to even address this issue, but we were assured both formally and in informal conversations that we had throughout the week as delegates and in presentations that were made to us that the incident that led to this issue which was several years ago now, that incident has been properly addressed and is continuing to be properly addressed. So now what? Reform has begun in the Christian Reformed Church. This is an awesome and big deal too. We need to understand that the Christian Reformed Church is a conservative and confessional church. You see, it just seems liberal. And I was wrong about this coming into this meeting. I understand things differently now. I thought that liberalism had swept up so much of our denomination, and that really the only choice that we faced if we wanted to remain Orthodox was to leave. That's not the case. Because what I saw this past week is that the silent majority that's always been there in the Christian Reformed Church has now regained its voice. You see, the liberals who populate so many of our agencies and institutions and publications, they're just a fraction. They're just a fraction of the overall population of our denomination. They're loud, but we found out this past week that they're not dominant. The massive majorities that every important issue passed by last week illustrates that fact. The Christian Reformed Church is a conservative, confessional church that just seems liberal. Now, reform has begun, but understand that there's a lot of difficult times that lay ahead. There's a tremendous amount of rot that's in our agencies, in our institutions, like Calvin University and Seminary. That needs to be cleaned out. It's important here to celebrate the achievements that we made at Synod 2022, but we also must note that these achievements represent the first of many steps that are going to be needed to restore our health. It really took us decades to descend into this mess. It's going to take us years to fully recover from it. We have to be prepared to play a long game here. We also need to exercise some pastoral patience in this process. You see, in Classis Minn Kota, we were in a different spot from a mental standpoint. We had literally already put one foot out the door, and we're almost prepared to take that second step out if things had not gone well last week. We had those things in place already. We had wrestled with that decision. That was hard to wrap our heads around. It took us some time to do that. It took us a long time to wrap our heads around that decision emotionally. Okay? Now, there's a massive rift in our denomination. That's obvious, right? The differences are not only in our understanding of human sexuality. Okay? It's important to understand that. It's not only in our understanding of human sexuality, but also in several other core doctrines. Even in the way that we preach and worship. Massive differences there. Unfortunately, there are many who will not want to move forward with us. But we do need to remember that they've just endured a seismic shift. Where we had a long time to come to this position, they've had to come there within the matter of a couple of days. They were not expecting to lose any more than I was expecting to do well at this synod. And they were not expecting to lose as decisively as what they did. Just as it took us time now to make the emotional adjustments necessary to leave a denomination that we love, it's going to take them time to come to that conclusion. And they're just starting to grapple with it now. We need to be patient. It would be awesome if they just got up and walked out the door. We want them to stay, right? We want them to come to a correct understanding, but if they don't, okay, get up and leave. Well, that's not the way this is going to work. And so have some patience with that. We do have a ton of work ahead of us. And so if you're listening to this and you're not from Worthington Christian Reformed Church, then what I want to encourage you to do is get your church registered to attend the upcoming Convention of Confessional CRCs, which is going to happen in August. This convention now is going to be even more important that things have gone well at Synod. We need to develop now a roadmap to implement and bring this Reformation to all aspects of the Christian Reformed Church. And again, we got to commit ourselves to a long road here. I think that we're of a generation that inherited this denomination. It was my grandparents and the generation before them that built this denomination with God's help, of course. And now it's our job to restore this denomination. And that's going to be a big, big commitment that we need to make. So above all, I'm grateful for how God spoke through his gathered church this past week. It was quite an experience to be part of. I appreciate Classis Minn-Kota for putting their trust in me and the other 3 men that I served with. What tremendous men of God they are as well. So grateful to have met so many young conservative ministers eager for Reformed theology. These are guys who came into our denomination because they were attracted by our solid and robust Reformed theology. And they've come from all different walks of life to be part of us. And it's good to see that, to see what God is doing here. So grateful for what happened. Implore you to sign up for our convention that's coming up here in a couple of months. And thankful to God for what he's accomplished on our behalf.